Vanessa comes to us largely in part to the fact that she spoke at a conference that my colleague Jeff was at. She came back very highly recommended. Of course, that makes sense. I mean, if you look at her bio, she's a third-year student at Harvard, seeking a PhD, and she also, I'm a veteran, so you worked in veteran pursuits in terms of their advocacy and their benefits and that kind of thing, so I applaud that. She's been quoted and cited in multiple significant different media sources out there. And so today she's going to talk to you about her book. She's a co-author of a book. This is with your advisor at Harvard. Yes, absolutely. Please do that. Vanna White, the hands there. And so we're really looking forward to. Please help me welcome Vanessa.
So as I said in my introduction, I feel a little bit of like black sheep here, since I am not a journalist. I don't actually study journalism. But I hope that I can provide you with some interesting information about my research on the Tea Party. And then I thought what I'd try and do was talk about the role of the media in the Tea Party, how the Tea Party used media, and then maybe we can I'll turn over most of the time to more of a discussion. Did I suddenly get much louder?
Yeah. Yes, that was me. I did that.
Oh, okay. I was thinking and then we'll have, maybe a little bit more of an open discussion with you guys about what the role of media is in social movements, what it should be, and how you've experienced that yourselves. So what I wanted to start with was just to remind everyone about how the Tea Party came to be. I find that people tend to have sort of only one or two. Yes?
Name of your book?
It is The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. It is an unfortunately academic title, but if you look for The Tea Party, you will certainly find it. Just a quick timeline of the Tea Party so we also remember how this came to be. In the early weeks of the Obama administration, and I mean the very early weeks, like February 2009, there were already conservative protests opposing his agenda. In particular, the stimulus, the mortgage plan, all these things. They didn't have a catchy name. They were protests around the country opposing what they called the porculus. This was their term for the stimulus package. I don't know if you guys remember. But they were quite small protests, and they didn't get a ton of media attention until one afternoon on CNBC of all stations, a reporter named Rick Santelli was on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and out of the blue, in response to a question, and quite clearly completely terrified the anchors back in the studio when he decided to do this, goes off on what became known as a rant, complaining about, magic is happening. This is amazing. Well, we're gonna go. All right, so it goes off on this rant about how the Obama agenda, particularly, he was talking particularly about the mortgage plan, was so now I won't have to claim to have data. I actually as an academic, it was pretty good. About how the Obama mortgage plan was hurting America, how the founding fathers were rolling over in their graves, and this went viral, very viral, very quickly. Within hours, local conservative talk show hosts all over the country were playing the audio on air. It blew up on Twitter, and the hashtag Tea Party became really popular all of a sudden in certain conservative circles. And then the Tea Parties are held in the next week or two. They're actually not that many, and they're not much bigger than the ones that were before the Tea Party title, the Portland's one. But they got a lot, more attention, and they were a lot more organized. Interestingly, the first CNN coverage of the Tea Party is actually about the role of the media. The article begins, local radio hosts are hosting tea parties across the country. So the local Tea Party, people who are interested in this Tea Party idea, those people were organized by local radio hosts, and they were the headliners usually at the event. And it was also their press shop that promoted the idea to the national news. So that you see a little blip of that in late February, early March. Then it was pretty dormant until about the beginning, sometime in the middle of March. Fox News suddenly realizes this is the greatest idea they've ever heard, right? And they start pitching weeks in advance the upcoming April 15th tax day tea parties. They have local organizers on, they bring on Newt Gingrich to talk about how many people are going to be there. And so and you can actually see, Yeah, you can see here, this is CNN versus Fox coverage. And you can see Fox in the slightly lighter bars. And that Fox News starts their coverage way before the Tea Parties actually happened, right? And Fox News actually kind of failed on the early Tea Parties. Their coverage is even lower than CNN's. But when someone at Fox News gets the idea in their head that this is a great idea, they start promoting it in advance, right? And I can talk to you about the ways they promote them, but the data is pretty clear. This is a very unusual pattern of media coverage, right? We not really see advanced coverage of social movements in quite this way. And you can see that when the events actually happen, CNN is as thorough as Fox is, right? They talk about the Tea Party just as often when there are actual events occurring, but Fox News manages to receive those events. You see the same thing later on. These are the summer events. So in the summer, there are town halls as congressmen are going back to their districts to talk about the healthcare reform. Well, suddenly they're met by hundreds of angry protesters at these town halls. A lot of town halls get shut down. And again, you see the pattern of Fox News coverage happening in the lead up, more even than during the events themselves. And then you see the same, so that's for the July 4th rallies, which are similar to the April 15th ones, and then you can see the same thing with rallies town halls. So that's,
was that hours of coverage or number of stories?
It's references to the name Tea Party.
References.
Yeah. So if you had it, because I didn't want to do it by segment, because if you had to say all about it or one mentioned it in passing, I thought this was the most accurate way to portray sort of depth of coverage. And Tea Party is an unusual phrase. I was lucky that way, right? So then you see, so there are these events in August, you see events, and then there's a big rally in Washington in September. But the interesting thing is that outside of the conservative media world, where Tea Party is already being promoted as sort of the big response to Obama, grassroots, nonpartisan, independent, all of these stories. Outside of that, the mainstream media is mostly referring to these people as wing nuts, right? Tinfoil hat, conspiracy theorists, people who wanted Texas to be a separate country. I mean, this is how they talk about the Tea Party. And that's true all through 2009, right? So the Tea Party starts February 2009. And it's not until February 2010 that CNN starts, and all these other networks start taking the Tea Party seriously. What happened at that time? What happened is that Scott Brown got elected in Massachusetts. It may also be related to the fact that Marco Rubio managed to knock out Charlie Crist in Florida around the same time. But all of a sudden, the Tea Party appears to have an electoral effect. And the mainstream media goes from having the Tea Party be a punchline to having it be the most important political event in decades, perhaps. So there's a real switch in the tone. And you see it right through the 2010 elections, the Tea Party candidates, self-described. So some of them have more ties to actual grassroots Tea Parties than others, are quite successful, or at least as successful as any other Republican, and are considerably farther to the right than some of their other peers. And so that's sort of the midterm election. The next time you really hear about the Tea Party in any real detail is during the Republican primary process, where you see sort of one candidate after another from the challenger to Romney, right? Because people don't, and actually every Tea Party member I ever spoke to said that they would end up voting for Romney if he were the nominee because they strongly disliked Obama's policies. But yeah, they didn't like his style, and they didn't like that he was governor of Massachusetts and all those other things. And they thought he had, and it was quite true, that he had supported policies far more liberal than their sort of policies. So the Republican primary process, where you see one candidate after another rise as the alternative to Romney and fail, and one after another eventually get Romney with vice president who's very pro-Tea Party, Paul Ryan, and having taken positions that are entirely in line with the Tea Party. So that's what you see in 2012. This sort of struggle within the Republican Party to simultaneously energize their base, their conservative base, and appeal to the middle, a challenge that has been a pretty significant one for the campaign. You might wonder what's happened to the local Tea Party groups over this time as we sort of moved to looking at these national candidates. And I went back, and this was in the great things on social media, I'll talk about this more. I went back and visited all the local Tea Party websites that I could find. I found 900 of them 2 years ago. Went back and visited, 2/3 of them were still going, and appeared, at least claimed to be holding meetings, every other Tuesday or whatever it was that they were doing before. Frequency has declined, a third of the websites are dead or they're not meeting. But quite a lot of them are still going. So I think that there's that's sort of a significant story that's never gotten any real attention. So that's just a little overview of the Tea Party, so we all remember what had happened over the last 4 years. What sort of research did I and my co-author do? So in person, I did an interview over a course of about 18 months. I did interviews in several parts of the country, in New England, in Virginia, and in Arizona. meeting with Tea Party activists, sometimes in protest, but preferably either at their local meetings or in their homes, and talking about it. In fact, I always start with the same question: tell me about yourself, what brought you to the Tea Party? Just sort of open-ended, actually understand where they're coming from. We also, as you saw during the Fox News data, spent a lot of time looking at how this movement was covered, when it was covered, why it was covered, and that process included, I showed you the quantitative data there, but if a Fox News transcript said the phrase Tea Party during the span that that data covers, I read that transcript. So I also did a lot of sort of qualitative research, which is really cool. Finally, we had the online component, and that's what I think you guys might be interested by, and might be sort of something we can talk about, or talk about whether there are better ways of doing that kind of research. We found, as close as I could manage, to every Tea Party in the country that had not done this. They basically all do. In fact, for a lot of people, it was sort of their foray into sort of online, only Tea Party tend to be older, sort of their foray into online organizing or online calendars and all this stuff, was to organize their local Tea Party. And so we found all of them, or as many as we could, about 900. And then sort of read what they were saying to each other in the message boards and what events they were posting and how they talked about candidates and how they talked about local politics and what issues they thought were really important. So it was a really great resource for us to get some information about what grassroots Tea Partyers were saying that was completely unfiltered by what national sort of spokespeople who claimed to be the Tea Party were actually saying. So that's the sort of data that we were using. And then I just wanted to, the way that we talk about the Tea Party in the book, I think it's a useful way of thinking about it, is to understand that there are three different components, right? So there's the grassroots Tea Party that we talk to, that I can, I'll tell you a little more about them, I guess. They tend to be older white conservatives, for sure, often with some organizing experience in the past. So they had, run a local church group, or they had, been on school boards, things like that. Often military experience, really sharp organizers, like the sort of people I wanted to bring them back to the Kennedy School and have them teach a seminar and organize. These are well-organized people who really knew, like, they would have discussions about, well, we can't have two PowerPoints in the meeting. People will stop coming. We have to have a speaker, and we'll do, sort of like stuff that keeps people engaged. And we wanted people not just to come and listen and be spectators, but be activists, be sort of great community organizing talk. Older white conservatives, and then in terms of the sort of issues that centrally motivated, and there's quite a lot of diversity, particularly when it comes to either being libertarian or being socially conservative. The majority, by far, were socially conservative in meetings, but also collating the same kind of results. These are socially conservative views about gay marriage, about abortion. They're often active in their church, and they're active in the evangelical church. But there's a vocal minority of libertarians who held quite different views, and they worked very hard. One of the things that the organizers were really focused on was working to bridge that divide so that they could work together as one group on these economic issues and stay away from the very touchy subject of religion. So what were the sort of shared views, if that's what made this diverse? The shared views, again and again, I heard language which will actually sound very familiar, given sort of Romney's comment about 47%. That, when I first heard it, it didn't even strike me as news, because that's the kind of thing we would hear a lot at Tea Party meetings, that there are about half of Americans work really hard and pay their taxes, they're involved in their communities, do the right thing, and then there are these other people who aren't doing their share. And there are these other people who don't deserve government benefits, but are getting them. Often, so that was the sort of framework that they had for what America looks like. And if you sort of pushed on, so who are these undeserving people? Well, first of all, the first thing they would always say is someone in their own family, usually a much younger person in their own family. It was really that definite, like, older person says that young people don't work as hard as they did, they didn't have it as hard as they did, that sort of thing. So they talk about their own families, but if you wanted sort of a broader perspective, it often had racial or ethnic overtones. We talk about plantation mentality, or like sort of racially coded language. Also very particularly about people younger than them, and it's important when you're thinking about that to realize that those categories overlap, right? Younger America is more diverse America, and for them those categories overlap. The young people they're not sure about and don't quite trust are a more diverse population than their generation was. And then the final category that people would consistently mention is sort of an example of people getting something for nothing, but illegal immigrants, right? They talk about unauthorized immigrants coming to this country, getting all the benefits and taxes without paying them, right? So these were sort of shared motivations that almost everyone talked about. We did just a little poll of the people we interviewed. And we got the president of the Greater Boston Tea Party to send out a poll to their base in the Greater Boston area. And we asked each what issue was most important to them. The top one was budgets and deficits, no surprise. Second issue, and nearly beat budgets and deficits, was immigration. And this was at a time, this was before the Arizona law, this was not a time when immigration was the top story in the country at all. So it was a really interesting thing to sort of get at that sense. So what were they? So when they would talk about this issue of who deserves and who doesn't in this country, it would often come back to Barack Obama, right? And some of that was, you could sense there was sort of a racial tension around it, like we talked about particular language that he used. But it wasn't just about that. It was also about the fact that he was foreign, or perceived as foreign, and also about the fact he was a liberal elite from a place like Harvard. That was a very consistent theme. And it was sort of the fact that he was at the center of all three of these slightly scary categories that made him so much a symbol for opposition. So those are grassroots encouragement. And I have to say, it was a great pleasure for me to get to spend so many hours talking to people whose views are so different from my own. I think that that's something that we don't do enough of. This is to be shared my normal views on the subject, but it was a real pleasure to talk to people long enough to actually feel like I understood where they were coming from, right? I might not agree, but you hear about people being crazy or being stupid, like when you disagree with them, and this is not true. Their views are very internally consistent. They have a lot of evidence that they'll marshal, and I disagree with them. I often disagree with their conclusions and even their evidence, but it's not. But I think just dismissing people because you disagree with them isn't actually the way to understand. So I had a great time doing this interview.
Speak up a little.
Yeah. Sorry. What percentage of you are like, I have no idea what she's saying? No? Are we mostly good? Okay, so I did a little bit over time. So what if I move?
Yeah, I think you're kind of more direct than this way.
Okay, so I'll just try and let you guys.
I hear
So
you
that's
great.
where it is. Okay. All right, I just want to make sure that I'm covering the ground.
Yeah, we are great.
Okay.
I got it over here.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right, so that's one part of the Tea Party. That's the part you see in the pictures, right? But for us, we really talked about there being two other parts of the Tea Party. One is the Republican elites who claim to be the Tea Party, right? These are the candidates who are like, I'm a Tea Party candidate. No one elected them on that, eventually they did get elected on that platform, but not when they said it. And there was no accountability for using the term. So you got quite a variety of people claiming to be Tea Party candidates. And, the spokesman who ended up being on television a lot often, had very little base, had very little people in the grassroots level had never heard of those people, and often didn't trust them at all. So the grassroots elite, or the grassroots versus the elite, I think is a really important distinction to make. And so one thing so the way that I sort of imagine that working is that the Republican Party in 2008 had a very bad year, and they've been having a bad year for a while. The Republican Party brand wasn't doing very well. Fewer people were calling themselves Republicans. People were a little bit embarrassed about being Republicans. George Bush had left with 90% approval rating. So what you see at the elite level is that people who had always been Republicans, and often quite involved in the Republican Party, even Gingrich is an example, Dick Armey is another example, realized that this language of the Tea Party, that had some new cash, like that seemed new and fresh and different. And so adopted that language to continue to push a series of positions that they had always held about things like Social Security, about Medicare. And so those two different branches of the Tea Party are running alongside each other. In some ways they overlap in terms of their views, but not always, and there's no accountability, right? You can't unelect Sarah Palin as Tea Party spokesperson. She chose that for herself, she had the microphone to do it, and whether people agree with what she says or not, you wouldn't know necessarily unless you do some pretty serious digging to talk to people at the grassroots level and find out whether her views are their views. The last part of the Tea Party, as we sort of represented it, was the conservative media. And I showed you a little bit already, sort of the way that the conservative media helped build that, just sort of as an anecdotal piece of evidence. So before the April 15th protest, which was the first really big Tea Party protest, Glenn Beck had a local Tea Party organizer, I think from Atlanta, might have been Texas, I'm not, but on air for a 20-minute interview in advance of her protest, when nothing had happened, no Tea Party actions had taken place yet, to talk about the upcoming protest that weekend, how great it was going to be, how many people were going to be there, when you should show up, all on what you should wear. And that is, and so if you've ever tried to organize an event, 20 minutes on national television, getting an audience of people who are primed for your message, who are older white conservatives, overwhelmingly the average age of a Fox News viewer is 65, and I think they had 2% African American viewership the last time I looked in on it. So you're talking about a population that is exactly right for the Tea Party message. You get 20 minutes on air to talk to people. That is amazing organizing, right? That is an amazing value. So we talk about the conservative media sort of really as the third tier of the Tea Party movement, particularly in that first year. I was thinking to myself, what would be the equivalent? People always ask me about the Tea Party and Occupy, and we can talk about that. But I guess the equivalent would be getting, if an Occupy organizer had gotten half an hour on Rachel Maddow in August of 2011, not once they'd taken over Chicago Park, in advance, letting people know that they could come, next month to this thing. That would be sort of the equivalent of that, right, in terms of organizing. So what's the effect of these different forces, sometimes working together, sometimes not? It's been a major shift of the Republican Party to the right. And there's all kinds of statistical data about who's in Congress after 2010 versus before on the Republican side. And I think the easiest way to think about it is to realize that, so now Mitt Romney would certainly never say that climate change was a real threat that was to be addressed. It's caused by humans, and we need to do something about it. He has said things like that in the past, but would certainly never say them today. 4 years ago, the Republican nominee was John McCain, whose name was one of the sponsors of the last major piece of climate change legislation that went through the Senate. So, he died in the Senate, but he sponsored it in the Senate. So the change in terms of the position that is typical of the Republican Party is really immense over these 4 years. And the Tea Party, I think, played a major role in that.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
With the Tea Party versus Occupy, where does something like the Koch brothers' money play into it? Because I've covered both as well, and when I think about the organizers you're talking about, they're not really what it's about. It's about the people who are behind it, who are pumping all the money in, and why it ends up on the TV stations for so long.
So that's, when we talk about the elite part of it, that's why I include the Republican elite as a branch of the Tea Party, on their own, and largely separate from the base. That doesn't mean the base doesn't exist, it does. But
I'm saying more powerful, that was kind of my question.
Are the elite more powerful?
Yeah, as far as really what the message is.
What the message is? Right, so if you want to talk about who gets elected, right, about who these Tea Party candidates,
even their talking points, that's what I mean. Where the actual talking points even come from.
The talking points are coming from Fox News. The talking points come from the media side. People like to think that the Koch brothers have magical powers to change the minds of the Republican base. Maybe. They certainly get candidates elected. They have a lot of money, they can do that kind of thing. If you want to know, if you wanted to understand what was going to appear on a local Tea Party website, so I would go to these websites, and often, some of the issues were perfectly reasonable, and sometimes there was something that was just strange. I was in a meeting in Boston, and all of a sudden, people started discussing how the smart grid, which is a plan to be able to send energy back to power plants. It's kind of like road repair, basically, for the electrical systems, so you don't have any blackouts. So the smart grid, right? Completely uncontroversial and not very interesting piece of legislation, was actually a plan by the government to take control of people's thermostats in their houses. And these are smart people who want any number of other issues, had really well thought out views, who, I would hire to run meetings if I had that power. These aren't, tin pot hat, tin foil hat, people at all. But they all believe this. And I was so shocked. I was looking around. This is not, it was just such an odd experience. All of a sudden at this meeting, to hear this thing that I knew had no bearing on reality. It had been on Fox News, and Becca said. So it was fact the next day. So if you want to talk about where some of the stranger messaging, some of it's, I'm sure, through the internet, it was easier for me to see it in Fox News because of the transcripts. Following WorldNet Daily is a little bit, you get a little depressed after a while. You can't do it on a regular basis, I find. It's also harder to track. I don't have a good system for doing that. But I certainly think that if you wanted to know what facts people had about the news at the local Tea Party level, what messaging they got about everything, you would at least heard it on Fox News. So yeah, so the effect of this, I think, was pretty significantly voted for the Tea Party to right. So that's just a little overview of sort of how we present the Tea Party in the book. I wanted to turn it over more to you guys. Well, I guess I'd say a few things about what did social media do for the Tea Party and for our research, right? I thought both might be interesting for you. So I'll show you. So this is early Tea Party organizing. I interviewed some of the people who ran Tea Party groups. The national group was most actually in touch with the Vanessa group called Tea Party Patriots. I think they're still going. And they were run by a woman named Jenny McCartan. And so she had told me this origin story of where Tea Party Patriots had come from and how she got involved, and this is how I'd been organized on Twitter, and I did not believe it. Didn't buy it at all. It sounded like how we organized on Twitter. I was like, what there's called you, and then you like had a secret meeting. Actually, they did organize on Twitter because I could go back to Twitter and find it. And so you can see her here talking to Michelle Malkin, who was a very early supporter of the Tea Party. That someone, Michelle Malkin, that she was in Huntsville, and did they want to organize in Atlanta? So this is February 24th, 2009. So this is 5 days after Santelli's ran. They're organizing their very first Tea Parties for the next Friday. So it was a really neat resource for me personally because it allowed me to confirm what I actually did not believe to be true. Michael P. Leahy is another one. He was actually more involved in the very beginning. You can see these ones on the 20th, which is the next day, about how they're going to have a conference call that's going to be live tweeted. And these are the various hashtags that they were using at the time to sort of convey to people who might be interested in this party where these ideas, how to get involved and start these groups up. And so it was neat because an origin story that I didn't buy in a little bit, there were some significant elements of which I actually confirmed. Yeah.
What is TCOT?
Oh, TCOT is Top Conservatives on Twitter. Very popular. He's occasionally been overrun with liberals using it as a joke. You can find there's little wars about this. A lot of the organizing TCOT and then Smartphone Politics and SGP is the other one. These were groups that I think have been involved in trying to get Drill Baby Drill off the ground. Do you remember that from before? So these networks are still going. They use them as a weapon. So it's great as a resource to confirm when people send things, right? We all know that, so that was really useful for me. The other thing is to help me get an idea of the scope of the Tea Party. And I'll talk more about how much I hate polling in a minute because I'm not allowed to talk about anything without complaining about polling. But if you want to understand the scope of an ongoing social movement, it's really hard. And the internet is really hard. So being able to track down what I think was a really reasonable percentage of active Tea Party groups, because I could find their websites on things like Meetup and Facebook, and Ning was very popular at the time. It actually gave me a sense. I could give you some sort of estimate of a number of people who not didn't just say in a poll that they thought the Tea Party was a good idea, who were actually doing something about it, right? And it's also neat because then you can see who they link to. For instance, Fox News. Videos on Fox News that really got currency showed up on their websites, right? They would post videos. So, and then the last thing is you could hear sort of relatively unfiltered conversations. Oh, I'll show you. So here's one of this is Meetup, right? So you can see Alaskans for Liberty, and they sort of, I hadn't realized that the language is not there is actually abrasive. That's like now that I looked at it. Well, Romney is just another McCain like moderate fellow. So like this, you can see these conversations happening kind of in real time. And, I looked at the ones in Iowa during the caucus, and it was really interesting to watch. And they're mostly really intended to be met, to reach other members. They're not really intended for an outward audience. And that's true for the Meetup ones, but also a lot of them have very sort of homemade websites. And they're incredibly useful for getting a sense of what people actually think. And as an example, I didn't know whether they were aiming their message outward or towards each other until one time we had reached out to a group that wanted to go there and do some interviews, and they looked us up. And particularly my advisor, who was very liberal. I think she's a New Deal Democrat, to ask the question. They found it on the internet very deeply. They're like, well, now we're bringing leftists to our. I don't know. I mean, it's quite reasonable. I would be very suspicious of that as well. Some of these views are very different from my own meeting and seeing the actual workings of my organizing. I would worry about it. But the great thing was that they had this discussion about whether to let us come on their website so we could read it. It was great. It was really informative, right? Because then you really felt like you were getting a picture of what people were actually talking about and thinking about. So it was a great resource for us. So just, what I would say in terms of what I learned, both about sort of how media and social movements interact and how you can use social media really like to get a perspective on social movements. I just sort of had a couple of thoughts, and then I'll open it up to you guys. First of all, the social media, things like this, like these websites, allow us to distinguish the elite from the mass parts of it. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than trying to figure out what's going on on television, right? Because this way you can get the views of the people in your local area, other local areas. You can get a sense of the difference between people's views, organizing very locally. And you don't actually just have to hear from Newt Gingrich when you understand the Tea Party, right? And one thing I'd say about that is that you can cover both parts. Because it's not like because there is an elite part and there's a mass part, it's somehow authentic or fake, what's the word that's used, astroturf. Because I don't necessarily think that that's true, or at least it's not a conversation in the sense worth. It's worth understanding the two parts and how they interact, but it's not worth talking about what's the real part of it. Because they both have real effects on politics, on the way that decisions get made, on how we perceive other Americans. All these things are true, and I think that most social movements have both parts. So I think that it's just important to recognize when you're dealing with one side or the other, right?
Did you research the role of California in the Tea Party movement? Because for some reason I thought California was kind of the biggest and the most powerful here.
So I'm actually from Sacramento, which is a Tea Party hotbed. The other organizer who's not Jenny Beth Martin is a guy named Mark Beckler. He's from my hometown area. And I just talked to Jenny Beth more. So I tend to talk about Atlanta, and I tend to talk about the other parts. And then of course I was on the East Coast at the time, now I'm at Oakland. But, so I think I tend to frame it that way, but it's absolutely true. Northern California was crucial and had their own organizers, a lot of early groups. And I think part of it is that they had a very powerful local conservative radio community. A lot of speakers come out of there. A lot of national conservative radio speakers spend time in Sacramento. So yeah, it's very simple.
I think it was a California group that backed Joe Miller for the Senate in Alaska. And I covered that campaign, and it kind of backfired because Alaskans were really on the pulse of the whole thing. And they ended up voting for Murkowski had to teach people how to spell her name to do a write-in.
Do you remember that they said that you could write Lisa M and that would be okay?
Yeah.
Because Murkowski's genuinely correct.
Yeah, but the Miller campaign tried to take that to the court to stop that. But
I didn't
it
know
was
that.
amazing though that Murkowski, because it's MURKO, they had to teach Alaskans how to, and she won. So.
No, I mean, I think and there was a lot of examples of sort of overreach, sort of people who sort of parachuted in, and instead of being actually locally run Tea Party supporters, they were sort of people who were like, oh, I have a great idea for some branding that will really sell my campaign. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. The last one's very simple, very good. So you recognize these two parts and see how they interact. That's a really good example of seeing how those pieces didn't come together in a way that was going to be successful. Another thing that I thought that the sort of media, like online and social media, is really good for is helping you get a sense of context. Because if you one problem that I often, Tea Party was very angry. Very, very angry. That was what you see in the media a lot. And it's because if you go to protests, people tend to sound pretty angry. Like, they're like, that's what they're there to do. But if you meet them in their meetings, you get a really different impression of people. And so I think that another way that we see people in sort of a less guarded moment or a less confrontational moment is to see what they say on their website. And I mean, it's probably true that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get the guy who posted this thing, I'm calling your black leftist liberal, I raise you black conservative. Like, you probably wouldn't say that to you. So I mean, you can hear things you wouldn't necessarily hear otherwise. I mean, maybe you can, maybe you would. But yeah, so I think it gives you sort of context that's different. And then the last thing I'll say is my little spiel about polling data. It was one of the most frustrating things about following the trajectory of the Tea Party was seeing the way in which poll data would be, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident, wholly misinterpreted. And this is something that several conservative media sources did a really good job of sort of pushing out into mainstream coverage, right? So one example was, how big is the Tea Party, right? This was the question for quite a few months, sort of late 2009, early 2010. And several conservative pollsters went out and asked the following question. They asked, would you prefer to vote for a Republican candidate, a Democratic candidate, or a Tea Party candidate? And you get huge percentages who would vote for the Tea Party candidate, largely because you can, if you run literally anything against a general Republican candidate, a generic Democratic candidate, or anything, people will vote for the anything. You know, because there's a lot of distrust in politics, and especially something that sounds neutral at a time when we didn't know very much what the Tea Party sort of platform, if there were one, was. So you get 30% of people saying they support a Tea Party candidate, and then in national news, 30% of people support the Tea Party would be the headline. Completely unconsidered, right? And similarly, another again, a Republican pollster did a poll where they asked people, are you a Democrat, Republican? Asked people who said they supported the Tea Party, whether Democrat, Republican, or independent. If you ask that question, Americans, 30% will always declare themselves independent. But that doesn't mean they vote independent. If you ask the follow-up question, do you lean towards one or the other parties, then they'll sort. You get about 4% independent, right? It's, I mean, y'all will usually ask the question correctly, so that you find out sort of what party people actually end up voting for. But they didn't do that. They only asked the correct question. So you got this huge percentage of people being in the Tea Party being independent. And it's just not accurate. It's not accurate to the views of people in the Tea Party. They are, in fact, conservative Republicans. If anything, they dislike the Republican Party because they are more conservative than elements of the Republican Party that they dislike, right? And so I think that especially local journalists get around this problem pretty easily because they either follow local blogs, certainly this one, but local and are more in touch with their communities in a way and don't get this sort of level of misinformation that comes from trying to do nationally representative polling on a small social movement. But it was a sort of consistent story in early 2010. The Tea Party was much larger, much more independent than it actually was. And anyone who actually went to meetings or went to protests would have had an accurate sense of this relatively small, but really quite dedicated and very conservative movement. And so I think that social media has a great role to play in getting around some of those filters, the sort of Sarah Palin filter, and also the national polling filter that is, I think, often misinforms us about what other Americans believe. So that's what I came up with to tell you guys about my book. I hope it was interesting for you.
Yeah, well, why do you think that they're playing such a small role in coverage in the media now?
Well, I think that, so if you think about the three parts of the Tea Party, and I will go back to this, at the elite level in terms of conservative media, it is not the time to rally the base. It is the time to convince the moderates that they want to vote for these particular kinds of candidates, right? So that the Tea Party, as a brand, I think is in its last stages, I would expect. It doesn't mean that people are going to not be involved in politics, or that the networks that were created are going to be. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think that the sort of selling point of calling something the Tea Party, I think it's had its moment. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did.
What do you think about this accusation or allegations of racism within the Tea Party?
So this was a really interesting thing for me, right? A lot of people have asked me whether if I were black, for instance, or Latino, what would my reception have been? I think that, what I actually think would have happened is there would have been, coming from Massachusetts, being at Harvard and claiming you want to come and study people is a really great way to get their hackles up no matter what, So there was a lot of suspicion of me anyway. And I think that maybe there would have been more at first, but I think that would have actually faded, because I think that what you would have seen is, because when people got to know me personally, they couldn't think of me as a sort of evil, cosmopolitan, liberal elite coming to look down on average Americans, which I think is what they were expecting in some sense. I try not to be that way, and I think that, if you had a personal relationship with someone, it's hard driving in boxes that way. So I think that that's probably what would have happened here, that they might have put me in a particular box as an interviewer if I were of a different race or age or anything else. And that would have sort of faded as they got to know me as a person. I do think that there is a strong racial component to understanding the Tea Party. But I think that the idea that it's just a sort of black or white issue is too simple. I think it's very heavily tied up in the sort of increasingly complex racial environment in America, not just that there are many people more Latino or Asian or more mixed race. All of that, I think they find very disconcerting as a general rule. As sort of an older white conservative population, it means that they don't feel that they understand the country anymore in a way that people would say over and over again when they talk about Barack Obama. They'd talk for Obama and they'd say something like, I just don't understand him. It wasn't, hatred, strong dislike, probably hatred is accurate too, but when they would sort of stop and they really want to tell you how they felt, they would, I don't understand him. And I think that in many ways, they feel they don't understand the country they live in. And some of that's part of the race stuff, definitely.
But like, you know, Obama really didn't do a whole lot of different things than any other politician. He turned out to be just,
I'm sorry. did you say-
Obama turned out to be
Obama.
just like most politicians, you know? So, you know, all this sudden uprising, say we need our country back.
Right.
Well, the country's been screwed forever, you know? And but why suddenly all of a sudden now because we have a black president?
So I think if you, there was going to be a conservative response to a Democratic president. There was Clinton was quite right. And there were widely believed rumors that he murdered somebody. I don't know if you remember the Vince Foster thing.
Right.
A lot of people believe that Bill Clinton had murdered somebody in the White House. Okay? I mean, that is, that is a far right idea. There's a lot of anti-Bill Clinton stuff. So I think the conservative, like, the people who were going to oppose, people were going to oppose a Democratic president, particularly when he came in talking a good game about progressive policy, right? There's a lot of, hope changing, right? So that frightened people, right? So someone like, people would say, they were like, he said he wanted to change America. And this was damning that he would say such a thing, right? So I think that there would have been a response to any Democratic president. But I think that the symbolism of the Tea Party in particular, I mean, remember, there were other symbols that were floating around, Porculus, whatever it was. The symbolism of the Tea Party was appealing to conservatives because it got that question, who not being a real American. Some of that's race, right? We know. So I think that had, if Obama had been elected president black and white in like some imaginary hypothetical world, it's not that there wouldn't have been a strong public response, there would have been. The framing might have been different, if I were to sort of conjecture about that.
Yeah, I had a question. Little disclosure, I was really active in the Obama campaign, like 2008, 2010, all the way out there. So I was in Inland Empire, and it was my job to organize people and to flip on who thought Congressman Joe Baca against the sport health care. So I would go to a lot of Tea Party rallies, Tea Party meetings. We would write up reports sending back to the White House and people that would read us. I mean, it was pretty sophisticated and impressive how it was going down. And one thing that really bothered me was this whole grassroots concept of the Tea Party. I'm not doubting the legitimacy and the passion of the participants, but when we were campaigning for Obama in the very beginning, we were sleeping on floors of strangers' houses and taking showers in truck stops wearing flip-flops. I mean, it was very grassroots. I mean, very, very grassroots. Then it kind of got to play loose. And so going back to my question, did you find anything very early in the Tea Party movement, Fox News was actually photoshopping those pictures of the protests in Washington, D.C. and stuff like that. Did you go into that at all?
So this is why I include Fox News and the elites as a part of the Tea Party, because they are really part of the Tea Party. But the thing I expected a lot of that money to trickle down. I expected the sort of Fox News, and it's true, they Photoshop pictures. They would just use pictures from different protests that were larger often to represent the new protests when they were smaller. And again, 20 minutes live on national television is not grassroots, right? And so I expected when I went to these local grassroots meetings that they would be getting some of that cash, that Americans for Prosperity or Freedom Works cash. They weren't. They were really self-organized. And I mean, part of it is that you're dealing with a population of people who are generally older retirees often. So, they have a little bit of income. They can organize by themselves. And they, really did have little fundraisers and bake sales to organize their own activities, right? I think occasionally, sometimes there were people who were like, well, go to the base, but should we accept the money for the bus that, to get to to get to Wisconsin, this big one, to get to the Wisconsin road? Should we accept money in these neighboring states so that we can get on that bus and go to Wisconsin and fight against the union, whatever, right? And there were debates about this, but actually, I think that on the conservative side, there's that advantage of having a pretty well-resourced population. These are small business owners often, but they're in their retirement years. They have time to organize.
Do you find it, I kind of find it interesting too that if the Tea Party movement was as robust and as strong as it was, then one of their candidates got elected in the primary. I mean, it seemed like
They never had a candidate. That's the thing. When I was interviewing people back in 2010 and 2011.
But it's nothing wrong.
Well, this was what they would say, right? I was like, so who are you supporting for president? That was sort of the last question we asked. I didn't want to get into part, that's party stuff right away. I went, thoughts, but Green Party presidency, people had understood very clearly that Sarah Palin would win, and some of them didn't like her. They thought she was a little bit of a showman. That was like popular perception. And that, what was that other woman?
Michelle
Thank
Bachmann.
you. I knew everyone would come up.
And Herman Cain, I think.
Herman Cain wasn't on the scene when I was doing the interviews yet. He appeared later on. But yes, so but they would sort of talk about people that they liked but who couldn't get elected. And then they sort of, people like Huckabee a lot. Huckabee was like a sort of fan favorite. Some people like Donald Trump, because I think he just said some very bad things about the birth certificate when I was doing some of these interviews. So that was, he was popular for a moment there. But there was no candidate that they were all organized behind. And I think also the sort of libertarian social conservative divide appeared, because there was some support for Ron Paul on the one side, but then on the other hand, you know, sort of the more ceremonial and white Huckabee side. And everyone would end by saying, Raleigh. And I'll vote for him. You know, like this was the thing that like, I don't like him. He was sort of like the John Kerry. You know, like I'm not like, he's not like Dean where I'm gonna get all excited to go out and support the guy, but you know, you have to defeat George Bush. I mean, it's exactly what you would have heard on the liberal side in 2004. Yeah. And that's, I think, true. They didn't have one candidate that they could rally behind. A bunch of people, they tried a bunch, none of them worked out. But they'll vote with remember, and you know, because the strength of their views about Obama are so strong. Yeah. You know.
What do you think can happen to the Republican Party? I'm sorry, it's not like a slow motion train watching them. And what do you think's going to happen now after, you know, it's like, you know, Obama's going to be elected? What do you think is going to happen to the Republican Party? Because it seems like they painted themselves as this corner of old white people. And do you think they're going to revamp and make a new brand? Or are they going to continue what they've done?
On the subject of the one thing that political science are terrible at is prediction. It's one of our major, well, probably many failures. This is one of them. So I don't, personally, I'm a little cautious about what's going to happen in the presidential election, in part because the economy is not so great that I would feel comfortable as an incumbent president, just given history. Also because I don't think that we can really model the voter suppression stuff that's been happening. I don't really know what that means for the election. So I don't know about the presidents, but I will say that I think that a lot of the Tea Party goals at the elite level will be achieved whether or not Barack Obama is president, because they won't control the House and the Senate. Margin is large enough to pass progressive policies, and they're about to face a major decision regarding deficits, which will likely involve some pretty serious fiscal programs. So that's what I'd say about that.
Yeah, I think you touched on some of this, and maybe I'm violating your cautionary tales about the comparison to whatnot, but it really does. I mean, my memory really was that the Tea Party was largely media generated. And that doesn't mean that it's not real. I get it. I totally get it. But at a conference looking at the role of social media in fostering social movements, I can't help but compare, which I know is another caveat, the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street. I mean, Occupy Wall Street was, if you want to say sparked by media, it was sparked by Adbusters, right? A magazine that most people don't know about, and they had made, I don't know if they actually had a date and a time, I don't remember, but they said, hey, did they? Okay, yeah. They said, hey, then on this day and this time, let's go. They never envisioned that it would be what it was.
Right.
But so aside from that, aside from the fact that it's one thing, I guess, where the Tea Party was responding to national media coverage and getting their sound bites from it, where maybe we could say that about Occupy. You know, I mean, there's a big difference between, say, a Fox News and a magazine like Adbusters, but then, you know, everybody kept questioning, what does Occupy want? Why are they so angry? What is their message? When they clearly had a message. All you had to do was read their placards, and you knew what they were, particularly what they were responding to. And yet you never heard people say, what does the Tea Party want? I still don't know what they want. I mean, I know that they want their country back. I know that they didn't like the bailout, and they don't want, but keep my government's hands off my Medicare. And so I'm just wondering if you could comment on that notion of grassroots versus astroturf.
Right. So I think that is a great question. There are like 5 I should have pegged to write down all So if you looked at the very early Tea Party protests, the one that were in late February and early March, before Fox News really started ramping up its coverage, I bet you would have seen a lot more diversity in terms of what the signs said. I think you'd have seen people who were angry about the stimulus, but also people who were angry about the bailouts. And I think you'd have seen people who were angry about Wall Street, right? I don't know that because I wasn't there, right? This was too early on, I wasn't there. But one thing that Fox News provided, other than one heck of a megaphone, and I don't want to discredit people like Michelle Malkin and conservative radio hosts, because I think they did a lot to organize, it was very significant. But I think one thing that Fox News could do is create a coherent national narrative. And the thing that the Tea Party had that Occupy did not have is the Tea Party position could simply be opposition to the policy that was moving through Washington. They could oppose healthcare. They did not have to write a new healthcare law, right? So that position of being in the opposition is actually really valuable if you're a protest organization. Or a protest movement. Well, if you were, part of Occupy, they wanted to see your plan. Well, it's actually not particularly reasonable to ask a crowd of 2,000 people what their plan is. It's not how the world works, right? So we know that. But it is really, you can get everyone behind opposing Obamacare, right? Or you actually obviously can't put any parts of Obamacare positive, but you can get 2,000 people to say their message is opposition to taxes, for instance, right? And I think that provided sort of a really strategic advantage in terms of the landscape that the Tea Party had available to them was in many ways a lot stronger, not just because they had Fox News, not just because they were older, relatively well-off, sort of middle-class white people with a lot of resources at their back. They also had, being in the opposition is easy.
If I could just follow up.
I may have missed some of the other points.
No, well, I think, I hate trying to compare the two and trying to say that one got favorable media coverage and the other didn't, because I think I agree with something that, Jeff said before that. I mean, media, at what point do we say, call it like it is, have an agenda and let the people decide? But just on the other part of candidates, it was so interesting that Occupy got ridiculed over and over and over for claiming not to be aligned with the Democratic Party, not to be fans. I mean, that was it was hard perhaps to get a narrative because a lot of those people were probably Obama supporters or anarchists anyway and wouldn't support any candidate. And yet, the Tea Party wouldn't claim ownership of any candidate either. It had to be people who were who self-appointed representatives like
And I think that was a real difference that you saw. You saw relatively mainstream Republicans adopt the Tea Party. They were like, I'm a Tea Party candidate. And not even just candidates, people would go on television, people like Dick Armey or Sarah Palin or Michelle Bachmann would say that they were speaking on behalf of the Tea Party, which is something that's not about what the grassroots did or didn't do. It's about what elites on both sides chose to do, which is a very different set of choices, right? And on that front, I would just add that I think that another part of the sort of landscape that was easier for the Tea Party than for Occupy, it's very obvious who leads the Democratic Party. It's clearly Barack Obama, he's the president. So if you're on the left, maybe you feel that you should obligation to support the guy in charge. In early 2009, the Republican Party was in shambles, right? The McCain campaign had been a disaster. Sarah Palin was sort of a very problematic figure. They had just put the RNC in the hands of Michael Steele. I don't know if you remember that guy. But he was he would last a year and drive the organization of the RNC really deeply into that. So there wasn't, and George Bush obviously wasn't going to continue to be the sort of standard bearer for the party. So I think there was a power vacuum at the top that made it easier for Republican elites to seize on this new idea. They weren't losing much, right? In a way that if you were a Democrat and you might, do I say that I'm an Occupy candidate? You're losing a little more. I think the risks might have been higher for you as a lead. That's my sort of 2 cents on it.
Why do some of these Glenbeck actors and falsifications why do people seize on those as part of the narrative? When you have Glenbeck say Obama was born in Kenya, and then the Tea Party says Obama was born in Kenya, and you have 99 other more reasonable people saying, no, that's crazy, here's all this evidence to support that he was born in the United States. Why does Obama was born in Kenya become such an important part of the narrative?
So this is, I think I would So I will say that I think the people that sort of respond to things being symbolically true, and I just not the Tea Party versus anyone else, it is all of us. We respond to things symbolically true before we actually check any facts. I certainly ideas are all that way. And I think that the symbolism that Obama wasn't born here was a way of talking about the extent to which some Americans didn't feel like he was a real American. And maybe, and so there's this symbolism that's very powerful for a lot of people who, would otherwise like Marx to be a pretty convincing piece of paper, right? Why we get headlines like, Kenya, with a question mark. That's about the media, and actually that's something I'll go back to you guys. So, what is it about sort of the media universe that makes that happen? And the one thing I would suggest, and again, this isn't really my field of study, but I would say that when you have a sort of media environment where at the national level you have some groups that are, maybe kind of on the left, like the New York Times, USA Today, or whatever, but they're trying to cover both sides. And then you have, frankly, partisan, 19th century style organizations like Fox News, which are absolutely in a journalistic tradition. It's just not the one we had recently. It creates a real sort of difficulty for the groups that want to sort of present both sides of an argument and consider that part of their responsibility. But I think that you guys did a great discussion.
That's a good point, because I covered our mayor turned out to be, in my little township, turned out to be a Tea Party person. He's gone now. But he said at a rally that he thought Obama was born in Kenya. So that became a huge, huge news story locally. And I found myself struggling between, well, he legitimately believes that. I believe that he believes that. How do I report that? Because I have to cover both sides. So I don't know the answer, but that's something I struggle with.
I think you saw it several times. There was sort of Tea Party memes that floated to the surface and suddenly became a story. Another thing, there was some idea that I think it was Agenda 21 is what it's called, which was a UN brief about shouldn't we all have bike paths or something. It's very boring. I've actually read the document. It came up so many times, and it obviously has no authority. It's the UN. It can't actually be any American law. But there was this idea, and it was prevalent in Super circles in Northern California. I remember very vividly, but also in places like Virginia and other places, that Agenda 21 was this long-standing, really conspiracy to impose martial law in the United States, do away with private property. One thing they were very worried about was concentration camps, something called 5-minute zones, which would actually end up making things walkable. But it was very, again, it was one of those moments where I was so disconcerted to see people who were so reasonable, so sharp on so many things, suddenly believe something that just wasn't in the realm of reason, right? Like Obama was not born in Kenya. The UN is not blocked with everybody concentration. These are not true things, right? And again, it was something that was filtering out to the blogs and would get mentioned on Fox News sort of in passing, but with a question mark. So it wasn't like, even never. But then I think someone was running for governor of Colorado or something like that, mentioned that the plan to install those bikes that you can borrow, from the city bike share program, was a UN plot. And that went on national news, and that guy lost his election. Because all of a sudden, when it followed up to a certain point, suddenly some of those ideas get shot down. But again, this is something that you guys know a lot more about. Was it Tom Petty? I'm sure he said that. But I think actually someone else who didn't end up getting, or was not in a office, But yeah, it's an idea.
Second time, we're going to take one more question. No, it's okay. And of course, we can pick this up at dinner and carry on the conversation, but for now, what is your question?
Sure. So I was wondering, it seems like most of your research was on these local websites and also on Twitter. And so I'm wondering how this moved to Facebook, where you can't really search it if you're not members of a group, and a lot of the conversation is taking place in sort of a walled-off area. What impact did that have for you, and will it have for journalists who are trying to track?
Yeah, so that was actually, I should say, I think if we're going to actually do about hours spent, the majority of my research was actually interviews, but I presented very heavily on the online side, so I thought it was more relevant to you guys. I do sometimes, dating sites were sometimes closed off. Often, though, one thing that I think is probably true is that a lot of these groups are not terribly internet savvy, so that a lot more might have been happening in an open forum than people necessarily realize completely, or felt competent to sort of close off. You know, they sort of had to keep it open for everyone. Because not that many people were, you know, putting passwords and do all these things. So it was less of a problem than it might have been for a younger, if my demographic of people actually was younger, I bet it would be harder to do. But the other thing is people actually wanted Facebook friendly. That was like one of the first things they do, and it was actually a way I realized, because I would not do that, it was a way of verifying me as a person. That they would get to see, you know, there was who was the strange researcher, you know, on the internet, I don't know. But like they could be my Facebook friend, they feel so confident about who I am, that I was a real person. So that was my experience, but again, I think it would actually probably be harder for most other kinds of.
But I know Occupy, there's just a lot of closed listservs and texting loops.
Yeah, right. And that absolutely, I think that in particular, I'm sure anytime you've got, well, I mean, this is a funny thing, but like people show up at Tea Party rallies like armed. Like we talk about, you know, unarmed protesters getting like pepper sprayed, like people would show up not concealed, unconcealed carry, right? I mean, this is a funny story, my last thing. I went to a meeting in Arizona, and it was a woman was talking about, they wanted to change the law so that you carry, concealed carry in parking lots, in private parking lots. And I was disconcerted because she had like a very obvious like bulge here. And I found her, she was quite nervous seeming, so I felt a little uncomfortable in the room. And then afterwards in the parking lot, she like was carrying her stuff out and dropped things. And I almost ran up to her to help, and then just didn't. And I like circled around to go from the front. But yeah, so I mean, like you're gonna, in any group, you're gonna reach different levels of suspicion from outsiders, right? And I don't know what the right, that's the methods I have to go with the Tea Party to be very different levels. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it.